We're going to try to summarize a lot of what we've been discussing in a very brief way for people who were not able to be here. The session was called Bridging the Digital Divides, Past, Present, and Future Initiatives. So we've looked at the whole concept of the digital divide because it's an issue that has been raised within the World Summit on the Information Society, and because we think academic research and empirical research should be informing policy and practice and discussion and debate within the World Summit on the Information Society, and that this is one area where academics, practitioners, policymakers can have a better role than they appeared to have within the first of the summits in 2003. So what I'd like to do is, what we're going to do is a very different format. The agenda of the conference was we had 3 papers presented in the morning and 3 papers presented in the afternoon, and we had discussants for each. What we're going to do is ask the discussants of each of those sessions to begin by briefly taking 1 to 3 minutes to summarize what the major points of that they heard. What did they hear today that they thought was of most significance to thinking about digital divides, thinking about initiatives to address digital divides, and what kinds of so what can be done and taken to the WSIS. But then we're going to allow the people who gave the papers to be the respondents, and actually what was left out, what do they really want to convey from their paper that may not have been conveyed strongly by the respondents, or that they may wish to expand on what the respondents had said. And we'll begin with a panel that was focused on digital divide initiatives. There were presentations by Michael Best at MIT, Paul Foley at DeMontfort University, and Panayiota Tsatsou. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
It's very hard to pronounce.
Okay. Anyway, I will let you pronounce correctly anyway. My apologize. And then they presented their papers. They took 30 to 45 minutes, and you cannot do justice to them in a few minutes, but I think for the purposes of summary and discussion of general points of conclusion and summary, I think it's useful to try to do what some people call the elevator talk. If you're coming up in an elevator and someone asks you, what did you hear at this conference and what was important about it? Well, we're asking our discussants to give that elevator talk today. But I'll start with Jackie Davis from OneWorld. Jackie?
Right, well, thank you. Yeah, elevator talk, a little intimidating. I hope that I do justice to your papers. Please do add all the bits I miss. But to start, Michael Best from MIT, his paper was titled Kali, Creator and Destroyer, A Personal Recollection on Media Lab Asia. And it took us through the many problems in that particular project. And he started off by positioning that discussion in an awareness of ICT project failures, and mentioning that maybe that was a good area of learning because there is a very high failure rate. And that was very interesting. The analysis of what went wrong in Asia Media Lab was very interesting. Raised a lot of questions about whether that's to do with the internet, the fallout on the dot-com crash, lack of funding, or whether it's human nature to sort of get into management challenges. And it was mentioned in the group that there were also problems in software development in bringing people together collaboratively in ICT. So maybe it is a feature of the sector. That would be interesting to know more. The problem of harmonizing clever people was mentioned. And Paul Foley from DeMontfort University gave a fascinating paper on social exclusion and the digital divide, focusing on the UK. It was an exploration of what's been done in the UK and what's most effective, and what lessons have been learned. And for me, what came over quite strongly was this division between providing information and talking about access and sort of information dumping, as it were, and maybe the more innovative use of ICTs to deal with some of the social exclusion problems. So it's two very clear areas of work where ICT has a role. And Paul emphasized quite strongly the innovative use of ICTs in tackling social exclusion and social welfare, like in health. So that was very interesting. Sorry, I must be quick.
Yes.
Panayiota spoke about the resistance within civil society in Greece to ICT, which was very strongly coming over in the research. And there was a question about whether that is because civil society in Greece is informed and don't want ICTs, or ill-informed and still don't want ICTs, whether it's maybe the weather. Thank you.
Okay, Jackie, that was a nice abstract of each of the talks, and I think the other discussants, you don't need to feel that you have to do a paper-by-paper discussion, but what are the key points of taking that? And I think Jackie's done that, so we can, and everybody around the table, we're going to ask everybody what has not been said that is important to say, so you'll have your moment. Yes, Christian.
Yeah, we were just actually joking before we started, and basically that is my summary from the morning session, which is culture important. So what apparently seems to be overlooked quite often in many frameworks that try to, or programs and projects that try to address the digital divide, is culture as an important factor to take into consideration when planning projects, but also in particular when it comes to sustainability. And from two different perspectives, actually, I think. That was what I got from the morning session. One was when Mike presented the failure of the MIT Media Lab. There was one element of where basically MIT going to India overlooked some of the cultural characteristics that you need to take into account in India, which you could summarize in, which you did quite nicely. The Americans were saying, after one meeting, let's do it, fine. And the Indians were saying, we need to build up a relationship, and trust only forms in different societies over a much longer period of time. And the other factor I got from the morning session was there are cultural factors which you need to study before you actually implement projects that try to address the digital divide. And that might be very different in India compared to a country like Greece. And if you tie, and I think one thing, since this is a series about WISes, to remember is when they actually try to address in the context of WISes and in the phase leading up to WISes right now, the Digital Solidarity Fund. I think this is possibly one input from this session to the discussions around the Solidarity Fund.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. Ralph Schroeder.
Yeah, just to follow on from what Christian has said, I mean, he emphasized culture coming through in the two talks, or in the three talks this morning, and I think one could put that slightly differently. That, I mean, what surprised me was how far the debate about the digital divide had actually moved away from access and to put culture in a different word. I mean, you could also say more focus on the users and what they actually do with the technology. And so I think particularly in the case study that Paul Foley presented, we had a lot of unexpectedly high uses and unexpected uses that people made of the internet, and I think that's been kind of a running theme through the afternoon too. Now, and in the case of Greece, we heard that nevertheless for cultural reasons or from the users, there wasn't that much uptake. So one could tie this to the afternoon by asking, well, what kind of policy implications does this have? Now, I find that rather a large gap to bridge, because I think what we also heard in the afternoon was that at the WSIS summits, it's mainly NGOs, it's mainly social movement groups that put forward different agendas. And I think, particularly if we come to the talk from Sri Lanka this afternoon, we heard there that the users, the end users in that case, and I expect in many other cases, aren't actually represented among those NGOs and aren't actually in any way represented when these policy groups make their decisions. So another interesting thing from this afternoon that I want to tie into this is that, I was talking to the speakers during the break about Sri Lanka, and they're actually looking for anthropologists to study end users and what their needs are and how these projects can be further developed. So I think this really, maybe anthropologists aren't doing enough. I can say that here because maybe none of us is an anthropologist, but this means tying all these bits together, that academics are sorely needed in order perhaps to be a kind of transmission belt from the users through to social movements or NGOs, in turn to put some of these end user requirements and the ways in which the digital divide has moved on now onto the agenda in a different way. I think I've squared that circle, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe this idea that there's a role for academics, because I think a lot of the early work on the digital divide was overly simplistic. I think that's what we're saying, driven by a technological fix to problems. And what we're hearing is not just the cultural factors are often neglected or not attended to, but it's a complex interplay of cultural, political, economic, et al. Factors that have to be taken into account, and to unwind the complexity of how anything gets successfully implemented is going to require much more careful observation than just sort of a quick technological fix in this case. But let's go to the paper givers in terms of what was not said, or that they want to make sure that their family at home hears in terms of this. But Michael Best, MIT, what take-home points?
I guess what I would want to do is taking the critiques of the three discussants, ask in particular in this sort of consideration of culture and the related issues, how much of that is just descriptive versus what we could take out of that would be proscriptive. The way I sort of sharpened that notion of culture, at least within my particular paper, was to think of it in terms of relationships, as Christian said, in both individually, institutionally, and sort of politically. And I'm just wondering if we agree that so many of these interventions end in failure, and if we agree that so critical to either success or failure is sensitization around what we might call culture, what we might call relationships, political, institutional sustainability, etc., then how could one come from that finding to a program that would increase opportunities for success? So for instance, if it was financial sustainability we were worried about, we'd all go do business plans. If it's institutional or cultural sustainability we're all worrying about, then what? And so I wish I had an answer to that question, but instead, reacting to the three discussants, I'm instead just left with a new question.
Yeah, but this sustainability issue was absolutely one of the major themes that cut through the entire day, and the exactly. But I won't. But Paul Foley from DeMontfort.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Two or three small points. The first is there is undoubtedly need in terms of just basic equity, basic equality of access to information services and other things for the majority of most populations to be connected. For whatever reasons, whether they be choice, whether they be financial or whatever, there is a large group that aren't connected. Obviously the digital divide needs to be overcome in order to get at those. Some of those people decide that they don't want to join, in which case perhaps use of technology to supply services that might help them overcome exclusion needs to be better focused on their needs. Or perhaps they need to be made more aware of some of the benefits that can actually arise from using the technology. And it's this cultural based, this much more user based focus on the use of technology, really by those providing some of those services, saying that, okay, there is a divide, we need to address it on grounds of equity. I think there is also an underlying view from some government departments or some government groups that it can help overcome problems of exclusion. I think that if that is the case, there has to be more technologies made available to those that don't want to use it, particularly assistive technologies for those that are disabled or in other ways finding difficulties. The market seems to meet those needs fairly well. I don't think some suppliers meet the more traditional needs, and a website seems to be the key way of providing information to those groups at the moment. In the UK, I think we fall very foul providing everything online by 2005, which for many groups has meant a website. If you're not connected, you're not going to use a website. Think of other things.
Okay. And can we turn to Panayiota? And if culture is one of the factors constraining the use of the internet in Greece, is it just that's it, or is there what could be done? What should be done?
Basically, it's not just because of the weather, as you said before.
Not just the weather.
Yeah, not just the weather. There are much more serious factors affecting. Basically, by investigating the Greek case, I tried to develop an alternative perception of digital divides as cultural divides in developing countries and countries that still lag behind in the information society, such as Greece. Such a perception differs from the common perception of digital divides as being the result of information inequalities. So this perception takes rather into account the role of the cultural factor in the shaping of new divides, and mainly I try to focus on the EU level of analysis and to investigate the impact of these divides, of these cultural divides, on the policy regulation and future evolution of the EU information society. So what I believe that it has to be done is that the European policy and regulatory institutions and authorities in charge should take into account the cultural distinctiveness of the EU member states, and they need to adjust their policies on the information society to this cultural distinctiveness, and to stop, in some sense, to try to impose very rigidly to all member states the policies and regulation frameworks.
Yeah, and this is a theme that came up again and again, that particular policy initiatives will not necessarily work across nations or even across different regions within particular nations, and partly because of cultural differences, and that it's not all economic division, it's also choices based in culture. Okay, we're going to move to the afternoon session. Sorry to race through this, but I think that then we'll get other points that have been left out of both sessions, if we may. Again, in the afternoon session, we heard from Barbara Crow at York University and Leslie Regan Shade at Concordia University on gender divides. Then we heard from Sharon Strover at the University of Texas on assessing some rural initiatives in Texas, and Harsha Liyanage from Sri Lanka, and Michael David, BBC, about Sri Lankan initiatives. But let's first hear from the discussants. And Sonia Liff, could you begin? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, Barbara and Leslie were talking, reminding us that the digital divide has a gender dimension, and that hasn't been incorporated into policies, mainstreaming in the term that they used it. And they say, over time, within WSIS, within other forums, people keep saying this, and other people keep forgetting it, so I thought I would say it again for this forum. But I think, as importantly, they said even if people remember it, what seems to be happening is that it seems to be about, oh, these poor women need help in becoming more like the good users, the male users, the lead users. And I think they encouraged us to think about, well, what do women themselves want to use the technology for? how could it be used differently? What would make sense in terms of women's lives to use the technology? And I think that was a link throughout the afternoon, was to say, from a user perspective, what do people want to do with this technology? What makes sense for them in their lives, and how does that emerge? And that sort of linked into Sharon's paper, where she was talking about how communities in Texas had actually made use of grants to establish centres in their own communities. And I mean, just to highlight one very interesting aspect of her paper was stress very much the importance of finding the right place and the right sort of setup for people to use it, and particularly stressing that these should be places that people naturally, not naturally, socially go to, where they are likely to be around, where there are other people that they can talk to, where people help them, where they don't feel they're just going there for the technology. So again, making technology part of people's lives. And I think stressing the sort of places that work, but also the unexpected aspects of that. And she talked about the importance of how a number of projects worked in community colleges, because these were places that people like to go to. But equally, some people who had experienced educational failure didn't feel comfortable with that. And I take away from that the importance of continuing diversity in terms of forms of access, and recognising the downside of some of those access places as well. So she told us about the problems of filtering. And then Harsha and Michael showed us very different places in rural Sri Lanka, and it encouraged us to try and think about the problems of introducing ICTs into places with, no electricity, no clean water, phone lines. And they stressed the importance of the human in this, and what they called the super user, who managed to keep these projects going in a whole range of imaginative ways. But they also talked very much about the danger of relying on these people in perpetuity, and encouraged us to think about how we can sustain those projects by understanding what makes people want to support projects in that way, and what skills they need.
Very good. Stephen Coleman, a second discussant.
I guess one of the key issues that I think was raised in the three very interesting papers this afternoon was about the mediation of the experiences and the frustrations and the voices of users in relation to what they are using. And one of the questions that has come up in our discussion here is how that can best be mediated. Governments don't seem to be very good at hearing users. Civil society doesn't necessarily represent all users, and certainly not in the language of all people using all of the projects and in the most excluded positions. Academics have been nominated as a possible group of interpreters who can somehow articulate and mediate between the needs of users and the failures of structures and technologies. And it seemed to me that in all of these projects, this is something we were hearing about, a problem of expressing and representing what it is to be a person in a society where there is general social inequality, there is also digital inequality, and there is also an inequality of voice in relation to how you deal with that inequality.
Thank you, Stephen. And Corinna DiGennaro.
Okay, so this afternoon the focus was very much on policy making and different policy initiatives, and I guess the question that came to my mind mostly throughout the afternoon was what makes a policy successful? Why do certain policies work and why certain others do not? And it is apparent to me that there are two main causes for this, and one, Ralph talked about this before earlier, is the complexity of the digital divide. One of the main conclusions of the day is that the digital divide cannot be simply conceptualized in terms of have or have nots, in terms of socioeconomic resources. but it's something much more complex. We need to take into account motivation, culture, digital choice, and also context. So given these premises, again, we heard from Sharon, who gave a good example of a community initiative in the States, in Texas, and then Michael talking about Sri Lanka. And hearing this talk, what became apparent to me is that probably we should need to give greater attention to the role of different actors when people try to think and formulate a working policy. And what became apparent is that governments, often the ones that provide us with the economic and with the infrastructure resources, are not enough by themselves. What are needed is also the perspectives of the users, as Sharon showed in examples from Texas, and grassroots involvement or social capital, community participation, and citizens' motivation to take up these ICT programs that are kind of like imparted on them. And then we also highlighted how there are the politics of the community, both in Texas and in Sri Lanka, that also have an influence on basically on the success of these policy initiatives. So to conclude, trying to put some conceptual order in all this, how can academics help in all this debate? And this brings me back to Jackie's question of this morning: how do we bridge the divide between practitioners and academics? And I think probably the role of academics is to provide good empirical data, good evidence-based analyses that help us basically understand which are the areas of priorities, which are the factors that create the digital divide in the first place. And then probably academics working together with practitioners can evaluate the main priorities on which to formulate a working policy, basically.
Thanks to the discussants. So we'll go to the paper givers to see if they wish to add particular points of summary and conclusion that maybe or amplify anything that the discussant said. First, Barbara Crow, York University, and Leslie Shade, Concordia.
I'll just start. So what we need is a research methodology for bringing together researchers, policymakers, activists, and community groups around. We need to develop and have better practices around that. And I think terms that are really important around the digital divide are agency, citizenship, sustainability, flexibility, and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Leslie?
To reiterate and to build on what some of Barbara and Corinna said, I mean, very often, yes, academics can lend credence to policy input through their research agendas, but these research agendas are very complex and messy, and it takes time to build up trust with community partners and academics and government partners. And sometimes I think what comes out of the research is the unanticipated consequences of how users appropriate or use the technology in often unintended ways or resistant ways, and that's quite fascinating, but it often is surprising to policymakers because this isn't what they expect to have found out. But these uses aren't measurable per se, so there's really no sort of quantifiable measures that we can put on this, but these ways that the technologies are used can be crucial for sustainability. They can be the community champions or the super users, as was discussed, that are very important for sustainability.
Okay. Sharon Strover, University of Texas. Yes.
Well, I thought the summaries were quite apt and went over many of the highlights of my paper. When we conceptualized this project, we thought and mulled over the findings. We really thought that our study had a lot to do with the fact that the policy conceptions of the digital divide don't map over communities' experiences very well. They don't map over how communities actually address the digital divide, and in particular, we saw that in examples of simple locations for public access, definitions of public access that communities express didn't map over popular rhetoric very well. The project process involved in redressing the digital divide at the community level also didn't do a very good job of incorporating the populations that were actually the targets of these different efforts. The policy implications, I think, do require much more attention on issues of social capital, fundamentally, which includes issues of leadership and working on improving community dynamics and even altering community dynamics and enabling communities to become more aware of their own sense of social process. And fundamentally, issues of inequality go well beyond technology.
Okay. And the final paper givers. Harsha, would you like, maybe you could stand and so that we can see you, and please speak up. You're a little ways from the table.
I mean, just filling the gap, or just, it's not a gap perhaps, but it's highlighting the underlying notion which perhaps not surfaced properly, what we want to express. Its super-user element has been taken up nicely. The word become a catchword, of course. We are happy about that. But, I mean, super-user had been only an indication. It's an indication of the underlying deficiency of the process which the telecenter or ICT for development process taking from first generation to second generation. And within the second generation, there is an underlying deficiency we are trying to address now. And that to address that deficiency, how we identified that deficiency is the absence or departure of super users. That's an indication of the deficiency. So within that deficiency, what we see is, I mean, that deficiency of over-dominance of the institutional element within this second generation, the ICT for development initiatives, and at the cost of oversimplifying the importance of social capital element. We call it movemental element. It's beyond the social capital. It's a multidisciplinary engagement of sociology, anthropology, sociology and economics, and sociology and environment, and sustainability in the mega complex, and culture. So this whole undefined territory to be taken into the movemental aspect, which is going into the sort of hidden element. So let's take it to the surface. That's what we want to do.
Thank you. And then Michael, David, would you like to add anything?
What I would like to add is what we tried to say all this time was there are no off-the-shelf solutions technology-wise, research methodology-wise, and project design-wise. So I think, and most of these projects that we spoke about are not money which has come from other parts of the world. And what I would like to say is, we really like to see your money spent with value for money. You'd like to find new kinds of solutions other than these off-the-shelf solutions. There's what we're asking is for a new approach to look at the finer ramifications of our projects.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, now what I'd like to do is, we have very few minutes left, but I'd like to go to the people who have not said anything yet, and basically, if there are any, it's the, takeaway points that you didn't come to this session completely understanding, and that you think that need to be said in terms of things you're taking home from this that you think others might appreciate. Maybe I could kick off, if you don't mind taking the prerogative of the chair, but I would. I actually think, the idea that policymakers have a simplistic view of this. I actually think that one of the main themes was the complexity of this issue. A lot of people think that the digital divide is an issue for research has already been done. That it's, that tracking change in the proportion of internet users, for example, is sort of, well, we know that, and that digital divide research is over. But we started with MIT, and it reminds me of Nick Negroponte's book, Being Digital, where being digital now is a moving target, isn't it? And one of the themes of this is it's a totally moving target. With not just having internet access, there's so many levels and complexities of what it means to be digital today, and where you are, The other is the complexity of the addressing these issues of initiatives, and because we've covered everything from the percentage, from the attitudes of individual users to the internal dynamics of a telecenter and how the super users interact with other people within the telecenter, to community dynamics and whether community leaders and community politics are together, to everything from that to the national economic picture. And so this is a hugely rich area of research that we haven't begun to really carefully look at yet. It's absolutely not finished when we know the percentage of internet users. That's just the absolute surface aspect of this. So let me ask who else has some. Ted, would you like to begin? Ted Nelson.
Well, the concept of a digital divide seems so simple, and yet if the well-to-do and well-educated have an advantage, what else is new? And the question is, how far are we going to work? How hard are we going to work to try to bring the others across and bring the others up to speed? Because those of us who spend all of our time trying to use the damn software that's out there know just how difficult it is. And the notion that we're going to just pull these people lightly across, have them jump over a broomstick, and suddenly everything is sweetness and light in their lives, I think this is extremely simplistic. The notion is, we can just have them lose their virginity, a simple transition, but like losing virginity involves enormous implications and adaptations.
Well.
So, depending. But this can be an unending institutional endeavor. It's like saying all the poor should have cars. Well, how big? And do we want to teach them to drive properly? And so I'm just a little worried about the simple naivete of the notion that it can be simply done.
Others, who haven't we heard from? Yes, Malcolm, would you like?
I think running through it, it's not necessarily new, but there's a tension between the desire for off-the-peg solutions, for best practices, good practices, and the voice of the practitioner beside me, but the saying what kind of advice can be given. The tension between that and the observations that things are culturally dependent, that things are different, and I think finding that balance is important. And I think there's a danger of being simplistic, of looking for best practices. There's a lot you can learn. And just the most positive thing I think I heard was the degree of use by the socially excluded. This was with the studies in the UK. That was something I wasn't aware of, and I think that's really positive and very encouraging, that when people see how the technology relates to their lives, they take to it. And I think that's where the answer lies, and people have to find out for themselves and be given that opportunity.
Others. Yes, Stephen.
I'd like to respond to Ted. I mean, this is not the same as giving cars to the poor. The question here is a question about citizenship. Citizenship doesn't work unless everybody has access to common resources. So this is actually about making the pavements something that everybody can walk on. This is about how you make information work in a democracy. And so digital exclusion, and obviously, can be taken up by a number of kind of rhetorical and interest-based positions, including people who want to sell more computers or get people to take up broadband. And if that were the only logic of that position, it probably wouldn't be as interesting to most of us around this table as it is. It's of interest to me because you can't run a democracy where those people who are better off in an unequal society are constantly having better and more refined channels of access to information, making those who are worse off more worse off, and making those who are worse off not only more worse off, but qualitatively in a different sphere of being worse off, because they're talking to each other and picking up information in ways over which they have extraordinarily limited control. Now, that's not to say that you can solve the problem overnight, but it is to say that the economics of solving the problem and the political and normative requirements to solve the problem are distinct ambitions.
Okay, I think that debate is an excellent point to maybe conclude this session. I mean, I began arguing that the digital divide issue is absolutely important to me, and I think to many others, because it's not just having the technology or not, it's that access to any information and communication technology reconfigures access to other resources. And as in a democratic society, yes, if you change not only how we get access to information, but what information people can get access to, not only how we communicate with people, but who we can communicate with. These are fundamental issues for pluralistic democracies, and so it's a terrific issue, but it's not resolved by today, and we only know that there's a lot more research that has to be done.
Come back tomorrow?
No. So the next session, we're going to stop the webcast, but the next session will deal with where do we go from here, and what kind of other what next meeting might be useful in this regard. And I want to thank everybody that presented their papers and in such a brief way, and in good sports about that. Thank you very much. Anyway, that's all. So we can.